Hello there. Today, I'm going to tell you an interesting story from the past, a time when people used habits and customs that would make us cringe today. We're stepping back into the medieval world, a time without soap, toothpaste, deodorant, or even the concept of daily showers. It was a world where survival meant adaptation, even if that meant rubbing yourself with vinegar-soaked cloth instead of bathing. Imagine waking up in a wooden house with no windows, no running water, and a floor made of packed dirt. Outside, chickens cluck and pigs snort, wandering freely in the yard or even in your kitchen. The air smells of smoke, sweat, and animals. You stretch your limbs under a wool blanket that hasn't been washed in months, and your day begins, not with a shower, but with whatever you can throw on to start work. In the medieval world, cleanliness as we know it did not exist. People didn't wash their hands regularly, didn't brush their teeth, and baths were often taken just once or twice a year, or not at all. But strangely, people did not consider themselves dirty. Their standard of clean was simply different. Clean meant not being visibly filthy. If your face wasn't smeared in mud, and you didn't smell worse than your neighbor, you were fine. There were a number of reasons why bathing wasn't part of everyday life. For one, running water wasn't available. You had to carry it in buckets from wells, rivers, or communal fountains. Heating it was a laborious process involving chopping wood and starting fires. Moreover, many believed that water could carry diseases into the skin. According to medieval medical theory, the skin had tiny pores, and exposing those pores to warm water made you vulnerable to illness. So what did people do instead of bathing? They would change their clothes sometimes. Wealthier people owned more garments, so they could rotate and send them out for laundering. The poor had one or two outfits that they wore constantly, patching them up when needed. If clothes smelled too badly, people would hang them near smoke from the hearth, letting the fumes disinfect them. Instead of washing the body, people practiced dry cleaning with cloths, literally rubbing the skin with a dry or slightly damp cloth, sometimes soaked in vinegar or rose water, for the wealthier folk. Some used herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask body odor. Perfume wasn't sprayed, but dabbed onto the wrists and neck in concentrated oil form. The concept of a bathroom didn't exist either. Toilets were often just holes in the ground, shared by many, or wooden seats over chamber pots. Waste was dumped out of windows or into rivers, leading to terrible sanitation. People would shout "Gardes low," "Watch out for water," before tossing waste out the window in cities like Paris. The street ran with filth. Teeth brushing? Not quite. People would chew on sticks of licorice, hazelwood, or birch to freshen their breath, or scrape their teeth with cloth, or even fingernails. There were powders made from ashes, crushed eggshells, or even brick dust. Sounds clean? Probably not. But it was what they had. Interestingly, public bathhouses were quite common during early medieval times, especially in cities influenced by Roman traditions. These bathhouses allowed men and women, sometimes together, depending on the period and region, to bathe in warm water. However, over time, bathhouses gained reputations as immoral places, associated with prostitution or lewd behavior, and eventually, many were shut down or fell out of favor. The rise of the Black Death also frightened people away from communal bathing. Another fascinating detail is how clothing was used as a barrier against dirt. People believed that by wearing multiple layers, they could keep dirt from reaching their skin. As such, it wasn't uncommon for someone to wear 3 or 4 layers in summer heat. Better to sweat into the fabric than let your skin be attacked. Some monks, seen as paragons of piety and discipline, would go years without bathing. Saints were revered for their ability to reject bodily comforts. And that included hygiene. Smelling bad was, in some cases, considered a sign of holiness. In fact, there are recorded stories of people bottling the sweat or scent of saints and treasuring it as sacred. Despite all of this, medieval people weren't completely indifferent to dirt. Weddings, church ceremonies, and festivals were occasions when people made efforts to clean up. They might wash their faces, comb their hair with bone or wooden combs, and apply herbal oils. Hair was typically washed with lye soap, made from wood ash and animal fat, harsh and drying, but effective. Women in particular paid attention to how they were perceived. Though daily washing was rare, women often combed their hair multiple times a day to remove lice or dirt. They would braid it or cover it with cloth to keep it cleaner for longer. Men might rinse their faces with cold water in the mornings, and some nobles had servants whose job it was to heat water for the rare occasion of a full-body rinse. In some places, especially monasteries or noble households, there were designated wash days. On these days, the entire household might take turns washing feet, hands, and faces, a ritual sometimes linked to religious practices as well. It was not about feeling refreshed, but about presenting oneself properly to others or to God. The idea of bad air also influenced medieval hygiene. People believed in miasmas, invisible clouds of bad air that carried disease. They thought that wearing sweet-smelling herbs in pouches around the neck or wrists could protect them. Some would stuff oranges with cloves and carry them in crowded areas to fend off these invisible threats. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs were a constant nuisance. Instead of bathing to remove them, people used oils, powders, and even crushed herbs to repel the pests. Cats and ferrets were sometimes kept indoors not just for companionship, but also because they hunted the vermin that infested homes. So how did people survive? The truth is, they adapted. Their sense of smell was likely less sensitive to body odor. They grew up in this world and considered it normal. And honestly, they didn't have much choice. Water was labor-intensive, soaps were expensive, and traditions were rooted deeply in beliefs and survival instincts. As we drift into the world of the Middle Ages, remember, cleanliness is a cultural construct. What seems barbaric now might have been seen as ordinary, even elegant, to someone born in the 1300s. In the next chapter, we'll dive deeper into how beauty itself was defined. Get ready to hear about lead-based face powder, bone dust, and the terrifying quest for pale skin. In the medieval world, beauty standards were not just about personal preference. They were signs of class, virtue, and social identity. One of the most desired features: pale, ghostly skin. But why? Pale skin told the world that you did not work under the sun. You were noble, you were rich, you were indoors. Tan skin was for peasants who worked the fields. A pale face was a badge of superiority. So people went to great lengths to achieve this ghostly glow, and their methods were as shocking as they were dangerous. The most common method was the application of white powders made from ground lead carbonate, often called Venetian ceruse. This substance, applied daily, created a smooth, milky complexion. It covered scars, blemishes, and the effects of smallpox. Women, and sometimes men, used it generously across their faces, necks, and chests. But lead, as we know today, is toxic. Prolonged exposure led to muscle paralysis, rotting teeth, skin decay, hair loss, and in many cases, death. Yet no one made the connection at the time. In fact, many believed that if the powder burned or tingled, it was working. There were also homemade versions. Some women mixed vinegar with powdered white lead, forming a paste they left on their skin overnight. Others used ground eggshells, chalk, or flour, though these didn't last as long or give the same silky finish. Among nobility, pale skin wasn't just fashionable, it was enforced. Some young girls were taught to reapply powder at every mirror. To enhance the effect, veins were drawn on with blue ink to simulate thin, translucent skin. This made the wearer appear almost fragile, doll-like, a prized look in many courts across Europe. The paler, the better. It wasn't just the face. Women wore high-necked gowns that were deliberately loose at the chest and shoulders so they could dust powder onto their necks and collarbones. At grand events, some even powdered their hands and arms. Men, too, applied light makeup, especially those in courtly circles or theater. In some places, such as Elizabethan England, the look became extreme. Entire faces were masked in thick, white paint-like layers. Underneath, the real skin often festered, cracked, and bled, hidden from sight and ignored. And then came the rouge, a bright red cheek stain made from substances like cinnabar, mercury sulfide, or crushed beetles. The contrast between pale skin and red cheeks was seen as youthful and seductive. Lips were also stained, often with plant-based dyes or dangerous minerals. Let's not forget bone dust. Some believed that grinding animal bones into a fine powder and mixing it with honey or rose water would create a natural skin brightener. This paste was spread on the face like a mask and left to dry. In rural areas, this method was seen as safer than lead, though the smell was another story. Of course, not everyone could afford these treatments. For peasants or lower classes, beauty rituals were more practical. They used clay, mud, or herbs to clean their skin. Some used goat milk or rainwater, considered purer than well water. They couldn't afford powdered lead, but they sometimes mimicked the look using flour or pale clay. Hair also played a big role in beauty. Blonde was the preferred hair color in many regions, seen as angelic or divine. Women would sit in the sun with their hair brushed back, applying mixtures of saffron, lye, and urine to bleach it. Yes, urine. They believed it made the hair lighter and shinier. The results varied, but the dedication was real. Eyebrows and eyelashes were often removed entirely to make the forehead look larger, a feature associated with intelligence and nobility. This left the face looking almost alien by today's standards. Women used small razors, tweezers, or even pumice stones to scrape away unwanted hair. Some applied warm waxes or plucked daily, and in some texts, it's mentioned that even soot was used to darken remaining brow lines for drama. Beyond the skin, there were other ways to show beauty, such as perfume. But even perfume was made from flowers and fermented oils. The rich would dab concentrated fragrances made from ambergris, a waxy substance from whales, civet from the civet cat, and musk from male deer glands on their wrists and necks. The poor, if they used anything at all, would crush fresh herbs like thyme or mint and rub them onto their skin. Looking beautiful in the medieval world wasn't only about looking good. It was a performance. A woman's face could determine her marriage prospects, her husband's reputation, or her ability to enter noble circles. Beauty was a duty, even if it came at the cost of health. Among noble families, daughters were trained early. They learned to mix powders, apply balms, and maintain posture. Mothers taught daughters how to sleep with their heads elevated so their skin wouldn't crease, and how to avoid sun exposure at all costs. In Italian courts, women often created facial peels using fermented bread soaked in milk, applied like a paste. After drying, it was peeled off to remove the top layer of skin, leaving it refreshed. Today, we'd call it an exfoliant, but theirs came from the kitchen, not a lab. There were even beauty spells. Medieval books contain recipes combining herbs and Latin prayers, meant to enhance charm or remove freckles. Some used crushed pearls, holy water, and moonlight rituals to purify the face. Whether they worked or not didn't matter. Belief was powerful, and it wasn't just women. Men, especially courtiers and nobles, used similar cosmetics. Pale skin meant you didn't toil, and red lips or soft hands made you appear well-kept and refined. Some even plucked their beards into shapes or dyed them. By the late Middle Ages, beauty manuals began circulating, handwritten guides detailing recipes for creams, perfumes, tooth powders, and facial masks. One famous recipe included boiled dove fat mixed with lily root for smoother skin. Others suggested grinding oyster shells into paste for anti-aging effects. Strangely, there was little concern for the long-term consequences. Women would reapply powders onto scabbing or infected skin, believing that hiding imperfections made them less real. Doctors occasionally warned of skin disease or poisoning, but fashion was louder than science. So next time you imagine a noble lady gliding through a castle hall, picture this: a woman layered in lead powder, veined with blue ink, her hair slick with urine and saffron, lips stained with mercury, and breath sweetened by rose petals, all in pursuit of what her world called beauty. In the next chapter, we'll explore another bizarre habit, one that involved using urine not just for hair, but for skincare, medicine, and even household cleaning. A golden elixir in the eyes of medieval minds. Urine, that golden liquid that we flush away every day, was once considered a valuable multi-purpose product in the medieval world. It was used not just in beauty routines, but in health remedies, household cleaning, and even as a component in textile dyeing and laundry. Let's begin with the beauty angle. In medieval Europe, and even earlier in Roman times, urine was prized for its supposed cleansing and whitening properties. It was believed to purify the skin, clear up acne, soften the complexion, and even heal wounds. Some recipes recommended collecting urine that had been aged for a few days because older urine contains higher concentrations of ammonia, a compound that modern science confirms can break down oils and dirt. Wealthy women might pay for fresh urine from healthy donors, especially children, believing it to be cleaner. The liquid would be gently applied to the face with a cloth or cotton. Some women would use it like a toner, rubbing it into their cheeks and neck before bed, leaving it overnight, and rinsing with rose water in the morning. This routine was thought to help with blemishes of the skin, a catch-all phrase for rashes, pimples, sun damage, and even scarring. One beauty recipe from a 14th century French manuscript called for the urine of a red-haired boy no older than 10 to be mixed with crushed lavender and honey, then dabbed onto the cheeks as a nightly mask. Aside from skincare, urine had other surprising uses. Barbers used it as a form of antiseptic after shaving. Medieval barbers weren't just stylists. They performed minor surgeries, pulled teeth, and treated wounds. They used stale urine to cleanse the skin after incisions. It was cheap, sterile, initially, and widely available. Urine was also used to clean clothing. Fullers, the workers who cleaned and softened cloth before it was dyed, would soak fabric in large vats of urine. In towns and cities, people were even encouraged to collect their urine in jars and donate it to fullers. In return, they might receive discounts or goods. The ammonia in urine helped strip grease and natural oils from wool and linen, making it easier to color with plant-based dyes. In some places, urine pots were placed in communal streets, and collectors would come by each morning to gather them. The English term fulling refers to this cleaning method, which remained in use for centuries. Back to personal hygiene. Urine was also a kind of primitive shampoo. People believed it strengthened the hair, cleared dandruff, and gave shine. Mixtures of urine and rosemary water were gently massaged into the scalp. Some users heated the mixture slightly for better absorption. Now let's talk about teeth. One popular medieval mouthwash included, yes, urine. People would rinse their mouths with their own urine to whiten their teeth and combat bad breath. It was considered a natural way to cleanse the mouth and remove plaque. Roman writings even described this practice as perfectly noble. Many of these uses continued long into the Renaissance period. In fact, the famous 16th century beauty manual, Secreti del Reverendo Dono Alessio, included numerous urine-based recipes. These were seen not as embarrassing, but as practical, natural, and grounded in the wisdom of the ancients. So why was urine so widely accepted? Part of it lies in the medieval understanding of the body. Bodily fluids weren't seen as waste in the same way we see them now. They were viewed as humors, substances with specific properties that could balance or unbalance health. Urine, especially, was considered a mirror of internal well-being. Doctors analyzed its color, smell, taste, and clarity to diagnose illness. If urine could tell you what was wrong inside, then surely it could help fix things outside too, right? In monasteries and convents, monks and nuns recorded recipes involving urine for healing boils, treating infections, and even curing blindness. One 12th century English monk wrote about applying warm urine to infected eyes to draw out the poison of the body. People used it on insect bites, rashes, burns, and bruises. They believed it drew out toxins and reduced swelling. Travelers sometimes carried small vials of their own urine in case of snake bites or bee stings. Applying it was thought to neutralize venom and stop itching. Now, let's step into the home. Urine was used to mop floors, polish metal, and clean chamber pots. It was common for households to have a dedicated urine bucket, especially at night. In the morning, it was either thrown into the street or saved for cleaning. In some regions, people mixed urine with ash to create a basic soap substitute. These practices weren't just limited to peasants or isolated villages. Royal courts had written records of urine use in laundry and even perfumery. A diluted urine solution was sometimes used to set perfumes into clothing, believed to help the scent last longer. In parts of Scotland and Ireland, aged urine, called lant, was used in the production of leather and wool. Tanners soaked hides in it to soften and clean them. Wool spinners used it to strip lanolin from raw fleece. The process was smelly, but effective. Even children were involved. In some homes, kids were asked to collect their morning urine into special pots. Some towns paid small sums to children who brought full containers to tanneries or cloth workers. But not everyone agreed with these practices. By the late Middle Ages, as trade grew and perfumes became more accessible, some wealthier classes began to turn away from urine-based methods. Imported soaps from Italy or the Islamic world began to replace old recipes. And yet, the use of urine persisted in poor communities well into the 17th and 18th centuries. So when you think of medieval life, don't just picture swords and castles. Imagine a world where your daily routine might include brushing your teeth with urine, rinsing your hair with it, soaking your clothes in it, and using it to mop your floor. It was cheap, always available, and for many people, a golden solution to dozens of problems. In the next chapter, we'll explore how women in the Middle Ages modified their appearance in ways that defied nature by shaving off their eyebrows and eyelashes, enlarging their foreheads, and embracing a look that would seem alien to us today. But even as urine fell out of favor with some social classes, it continued to hold a certain mystique. In folk medicine and village remedies, older women, often known as wise women or healers, passed down recipes involving urine through generations. These women understood which type of urine was best. Fresh urine had its purposes, but stale urine, especially aged 3 to 5 days, was prized for its chemical potency. Stale urine was sometimes mixed with crushed nettles or onion to create poultices for drawing out splinters or treating sores. For livestock wounds, it was sometimes poured directly onto infected hooves, or rubbed onto animal fur as a remedy for lice. In Northern Europe, urine also made its way into the world of divination. Seers and herbalists would sometimes read the shapes and colors of urine to interpret a person's future. A cloudy appearance might signal trouble, while a golden and cheerful stream was believed to bring luck. There were even fertility tests using urine mixed with wheat or barley seeds. If the seeds sprouted, the woman was said to be pregnant. Interestingly, the acceptance of urine in daily life made it a non-taboo subject. Unlike today, where bodily functions are often private and even embarrassing, medieval people were more pragmatic. They had fewer illusions about the human body. After all, everyone saw the same things: chamber pots, privies, and street waste. In that environment, urine simply became a tool. And what about literature? Surprisingly, medieval poems and plays occasionally referenced the practical uses of urine with humor or satire. One surviving joke from a 15th century English manuscript involves a man accused of being too clean, prompting his wife to scold him. "What? You scrub with soap when good piss lies near?" It was a comedic nod to the idea that luxury was unnecessary when nature provided. In terms of hygiene, the Renaissance slowly changed public opinion. With the printing press spreading medical knowledge and the rise of anatomy as a science, people started to question traditional remedies. Urine began to be examined more scientifically, used for urinalysis but less for direct application. Still, in rural pockets, practices persisted. By the 17th century, some physicians even recommended drinking urine as part of a health regimen. Known as urotherapy, it was believed to restore vitality, especially if the urine was taken from a young, healthy person or one who had fasted. Manuals from the time described drinking morning urine on an empty stomach to clear skin, boost immunity, and even sharpen the mind. This idea resurfaced centuries later in alternative medicine circles. But in the medieval mindset, such practices weren't fringe, they were mainstream. They represented a balance between the spiritual and physical, between humility and necessity. We can't ignore the symbolic side either. In religious texts, urine was sometimes a metaphor for purification or transformation. Just as fire purified metal, urine was thought to purify the body. The smell, while unpleasant, was a sign of its strength. Some monks even documented how fasting altered the smell and potency, suggesting that the purer the lifestyle, the more effective the urine. What's astonishing is how far this one bodily fluid traveled in medieval life. It went from face to fabric, from medicine to magic. It was a cleanser, a remedy, a symbol, and a tool. And unlike so many lost rituals, urine use was thoroughly recorded, studied, and even taxed in some regions. Today, of course, we react with disgust. But perhaps the real surprise isn't how they used urine, but how practical and efficient they were in a world without modern tools. In an age before industrial cleaning products, antibiotics, and dermatology, they found answers where they could. So, if you ever visit a medieval reenactment or museum and you see a small ceramic pot tucked under a bed, just remember, that wasn't for decoration. That was their all-purpose beauty product: shampoo, detergent, and health tonic, all in one. In the next chapter, we'll leave behind bodily fluids and look at how the face itself was reshaped. Why did medieval people want high, bald foreheads? What made a person beautiful in a time without mascara or contouring? You're about to find out. The high forehead and vanishing eyelashes, beauty through subtraction. In the medieval world, beauty wasn't always about adding color or sparkle. Sometimes it was about taking things away, especially from the face. If you've ever seen portraits of medieval noblewomen or queens, you might have noticed something strange. Their faces are bare, their eyebrows are missing, and their foreheads seem almost unnaturally high. This wasn't an accident. This was the fashion. Let's begin with the forehead. In many parts of medieval Europe, especially in the 14th and 15th centuries, a high, smooth, rounded forehead was considered the ultimate sign of beauty, intelligence, and nobility. A prominent forehead suggested purity, wisdom, and sophistication. It was a look that separated the elite from the common folk, who typically had tanned skin and ordinary faces. To achieve this ideal, women went to surprising lengths. They plucked their hairlines, yes, from the top of the forehead. Using small tweezers or special threads, they would remove rows of hair, often several centimeters back from the natural hairline. The more skin that showed between the eyebrows and the start of the hair, the better. Some women even used cloths soaked in vinegar or lye to burn off the fine hairs they couldn't pluck. The process was painful and time-consuming, but it was a common part of the daily routine for upper-class women. They would sit in front of polished metal mirrors, carefully removing hairs one by one. The results were dramatic. A smooth, egg-shaped upper face that looked like a canvas. In fact, this shape was sometimes compared to the Virgin Mary in religious art, making it not only fashionable, but spiritually admired. But the forehead wasn't the only part of the face that got special treatment. Eyebrows and eyelashes were also removed entirely. That's right, completely gone. Women wanted a clean, uninterrupted face. Eyebrows were seen as messy or wild. Removing them created a blank, serene expression that was considered elegant. Eyelashes, which we often highlight and curl today, were plucked out using small bone or metal tweezers. Without brows or lashes, the eyes appeared larger and rounder. Some women enhanced this effect by applying pale powders or light oil around the eyes to reflect candlelight. The idea was to look calm, luminous, and unbothered by earthly concerns, an appearance that mirrored religious saints and noble ideals. In some cases, faint eyebrow lines were drawn back on using charcoal or crushed minerals. These lines were thin, highly arched, and placed far above the natural brow bone. They gave the face a look of quiet sophistication, at least by medieval standards. To the modern eye, this look can seem eerie, but in its time, it was beautiful. Why did these trends develop in the first place? In part, it was about distinction. The noble class was always looking for ways to separate itself from the working poor. While peasants were tanned, sweaty, and often hairy due to outdoor labor, nobles had the luxury to alter their appearance. Pale skin, hairless faces, and high foreheads became symbols of wealth, status, and education. There was also a religious dimension. The medieval church promoted ideals of humility, modesty, and detachment from earthly pleasures. A bare, expressionless face aligned with the image of saintly women, those who rejected vanity and sensuality. Ironically, women went to great lengths to achieve this natural holiness. And let's not forget the influence of art. Many painters of the time portrayed women with elongated, serene faces. These portraits reinforced the beauty ideals of the day. Young women wanted to look like the women in paintings, and the artists painted what society found beautiful. Of course, the trend wasn't limited to women. Some men also adopted the high forehead look, especially those at royal courts. Removing stray hairs and maintaining a smooth brow line was a sign of refinement. Male nobles often shaped their beards carefully and avoided thick, unruly eyebrows. A controlled appearance suggested a controlled mind, a virtue in the complex world of politics and diplomacy. Among women, beauty routines were passed from mother to daughter. Girls as young as 10 might begin learning to pluck their brows or press warm cloths to their faces to loosen the tiny hairs. Recipes for hair removal creams were written in family books and shared across generations. One popular formula included cat dung, vinegar, and burned almond shells mixed into a paste and applied to the hairline. The mixture would be left for hours and then wiped away, ideally pulling fine hairs with it. The smell? Probably unbearable, but the effect fashionable. In noble courts, beauty rituals became part of social life. Women would gather in private chambers to pluck, wash, powder, and share recipes. These moments were more than grooming. They were bonding sessions, places for gossip and alliance building. But what about the consequences? With no modern skincare, plucking and burning the face often led to infections, scarring, and swelling. Some women had permanent hair loss or developed painful sores. Yet they continued the routines, driven by expectations and tradition. A woman who let her brows grow out might be mocked or pitied. The trend also appeared in literature. Poets described heroines with foreheads like ivory and eyes wide as moons. Eyebrows were called shadows or echoes of thought, phrases that reinforced the idea that beauty was delicate, even ghostly. By the 16th century, the high forehead trend began to fade, replaced by new obsessions: curled hair, powdered wigs, and eventually makeup. So next time you look in the mirror and consider shaping your brows or trying a new style, remember the noblewomen of the 1400s, patiently plucking away their identity, one hair at a time, in pursuit of the perfect blank canvas. In the next chapter, we'll explore another curious aspect of medieval life: how beer, wine, and ale became the drinks of choice, even for children, all because clean water was too dangerous to drink. While this fashion may seem absurd today, it reflected a deep cultural obsession with control and refinement. A woman's face was her social armor, in a world where her status and marriage prospects were tightly connected to how she looked. Keeping up with beauty standards wasn't optional, it was survival. Beyond the aesthetic, there were also beliefs tied to astrology and humoral theory. Some physicians of the time wrote that a high forehead allowed the spirits of air and light to better circulate through the mind. A smooth, pale brow was thought to channel intelligence and clarity. It was more than just pretty. It was mystical. The removal of body hair was also symbolic. Medieval Christian teachings often equated body hair, especially in women, with sin and wildness. Removing it became a gesture of discipline and virtue. Hair, especially pubic hair, was linked to lust. Plucking the brows and shaving parts of the head were seen as taming the animal within, aligning the body with spiritual ideals. Even convents participated in these trends. Young nuns, before taking their vows, often had their heads and brows shaved as a sign of humility and renunciation of vanity. However, inside noble nunneries, these acts sometimes morphed into beauty rituals of their own. Clean faces and high foreheads were maintained not only as symbols of piety, but also as markers of elite status. In some regions, women who didn't conform were subject to ridicule or gossip. Local songs and stories would mock wild-browed maidens or refer to the beastly girl with the peasant's face. These weren't just jokes, they were tools of social pressure. Archaeological finds have even uncovered grooming tools, tweezers made of bronze, delicate razors, and polished bone combs used not just for hair, but for scraping the skin and shaping the brow line. Some items were carved with initials, family symbols, or small prayers, showing just how personal and valued the act of grooming was. Interestingly, these ideals also influenced architecture and sculpture. Statues of noble women featured the same bald foreheads and hairless faces seen in paintings. Even on cathedrals and tombs, women were immortalized with this ethereal appearance, forever captured in stone with smooth brows and serene expressions. But change was inevitable. As the Renaissance took hold and rediscovered the ideals of ancient Rome and Greece. Fuller brows and more natural features came back into fashion. Beauty became more about symmetry and proportion than about stark minimalism. Still, the memory of the high forehead remained. In some noble houses, family portraits spanning generations showed the transition from plucked to natural, a visual history of changing values. Modern artists and historians now revisit these trends with both curiosity and compassion. We can recognize the absurdity while understanding the human need behind them to belong, to be admired, to feel beautiful in one's own time. Today, we use pencils to fill in brows, serums to grow lashes, and lasers to reshape hairlines. But the drive is the same, to fit into a world that tells us how we should look. The medieval woman with a plucked hairline and smooth brow was simply following the same instinct. So as we leave behind the bare faces of the past, let's not judge them too harshly. Let's appreciate how beauty evolves and how each age has its own kind of strange. In the next chapter, we'll trade tweezers for tankards and explore how alcohol became the drink of choice in daily medieval life, and why even children drank ale instead of water. Ale for breakfast, why medieval people drank beer instead of water. In the medieval world, the idea of drinking water, plain, untreated, natural water, was not only rare, but often considered downright dangerous. People across Europe, from noble courts to humble farmsteads, avoided water whenever possible, and for good reason. Water sources in medieval towns and villages were often contaminated. Rivers and streams, even wells, were frequently polluted with waste from humans and animals. With no understanding of bacteria or waterborne pathogens, people relied on observation and experience, and they noticed a clear pattern. Those who drank only water were often the ones who got sick, so they turned to something safer, something boiled, something fermented. Enter beer and ale, the staple beverages of medieval Europe. Now let's clarify a few things. The beer of the Middle Ages wasn't like the IPA or craft lagers we know today. It was usually weak in alcohol, cloudy, thick, and often described as slightly sour or bready. This version, known as small beer or small ale, contained just enough alcohol to kill harmful bacteria, making it far safer to drink than plain water. This beer wasn't reserved for adults. Children drank it too. From the age of 2 or 3, it was served at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Some monasteries even gave toddlers beer as part of their daily rations. For adults, stronger versions of beer were available, especially for celebrations or evening meals. But the everyday beer, the one consumed throughout the day, had an alcohol content of just 1 to 2%. Enough to sterilize, not enough to intoxicate. Unless, of course, you drank it by the gallon. Brewing was a domestic skill. In most homes, the woman of the house was responsible for making beer, fermenting it in clay or wooden barrels, and flavoring it with herbs or spices. Hops, the bitter flower used in modern brewing, wasn't widely adopted in Europe until later centuries. Early beers were flavored with a blend called gruit, which included plants like yarrow, mugwort, and rosemary. Every village had its own unique recipe. Some added honey, fruits, or even pieces of bread. In monasteries, monks took brewing to an art form. They recorded recipes, refined fermentation methods, and sometimes produced several varieties. One for guests, one for feasts, and one for daily consumption. Drinking ale wasn't just a matter of health. It was part of the culture. At mealtimes, beer was poured into wooden or pewter cups. Large households might have a shared jug passed around the table. In smaller cottages, children and parents drank from the same vessel. Ale was also used in cooking, added to soups, stews, and even porridge. Bread soaked in beer made a common breakfast. In some regions, beer mixed with eggs and spices formed a kind of morning tonic. Festivals, of course, featured stronger brews. Special ales were brewed for weddings, harvests, or saint days. These were more potent and carefully guarded. In fact, many feasts had a designated ale keeper to ensure the beer wasn't stolen or watered down before the event. In towns and cities, beer became big business. Breweries emerged, and the ale wife, a woman who brewed and sold beer from her home, became a common figure. She might hang a broom outside her door as a sign that ale was for sale. Some historians believe this image contributed to the later stereotype of the witch with a broom. As the popularity of ale grew, regulations followed. Kings and local councils began taxing beer. Guilds were formed to control the quality and price. In England, the assize of ale was a law that allowed officials to inspect and taste beer to ensure it met standards. But beer wasn't the only fermented beverage consumed. Wine was common in southern Europe, in places like France, Italy, and Spain. However, wine was often diluted with water and reserved for the wealthier classes. Monks and priests used wine in religious ceremonies and often maintained their own vineyards. For the poor, wine was a luxury. Beer was the drink of the people. Interestingly, the choice between beer and wine often followed regional lines, not just due to agriculture, but culture. In the North, beer was seen as hearty and strong. In the South, wine was viewed as refined and spiritual. This divide even sparked political and religious commentary in some writings. But let's return to water. It's not that medieval people never drank water. In rural areas, spring water or fresh mountain streams were sometimes safe and prized. People living far from towns often had cleaner water sources, and they drank from them without issue. But in urban areas where populations were dense and waste systems non-existent, water was a last resort. Some sources suggest that people might test water by appearance, smell, and even taste. If it looked too cloudy or had a foul odor, it was avoided. Boiling was known to improve safety, but since firewood was expensive and time-consuming to gather, boiling water for drinking was rare. That's why beer became the default. It was safer, tastier, and more nourishing. It provided calories, vitamins from yeast, and a bit of warmth on cold mornings. For the working class, beer was a vital part of survival. Even children learned early to brew simple batches. Teenagers might be tasked with preparing daily beer for the household. And because fermentation happened quickly, often within a few days, there was always a fresh batch ready to replace the last one. So the next time you hear someone complain about not having their morning coffee, imagine a medieval child grumbling that their breakfast beer was too flat. In the next chapter, we'll look at the medieval table itself and discover what kinds of strange, fermented, moldy, or mushy foods made up a typical meal. From cheese with live maggots to desserts made of meat fat, prepare your stomach for a culinary adventure from the past. Drinking ale wasn't just for necessity. It was deeply embedded in the social rituals of everyday life. In the taverns, ale flowed constantly. These establishments weren't just bars, they were vital community hubs. People met to exchange news, arrange marriages, discuss business, or even hear poetry recitations. Many taverns served only ale, and some brewed their own special house versions. In fact, the difference between a good tavern and a bad one was often the quality of its beer. Word of mouth could make or break an alehouse. Travelers would plan their routes based on which inns had sweet drink and which ones had sour swill. Medieval guidebooks, yes, those existed, sometimes rated places based on their ale. And for religious communities, beer was sometimes more than a drink. It was charity. Monasteries often gave beer to the poor as part of their almsgiving. In colder regions, monks might brew extra strong ale called liquid bread, which provided nourishment during fasts. This was especially true during Lent or periods of extended abstinence when solid food was restricted. One famous type of strong beer was Doppelbock, brewed by German monks. Rich in calories and designed to sustain the body through long fasts, it became a sort of spiritual loophole. God doesn't mind if I drink my bread. Beer also played a role in medicine. Herbalists would sometimes brew medicinal ales infused with plants like chamomile, sage, wormwood, or fennel. These brews were believed to treat stomach ailments, headaches, and even melancholy. Some were so bitter or strong-smelling that they were consumed only in small amounts, like a potion. Interestingly, beer even had a place in political life. When kings or nobles made public appearances, they often sponsored open feasts where barrels of ale were distributed freely. These gestures of generosity were remembered and celebrated for years. In some towns, the quality of beer a ruler provided could influence public loyalty. Ale was also tied to gender roles. Brewing, as mentioned, was originally a woman's task. The alewife was a respected, though sometimes feared, figure. She controlled the supply, set prices, and maintained the family's reputation. Some women became wealthy and powerful through beer sales. Others, especially those who were unmarried or too successful, were later accused of witchcraft. Their knowledge of fermentation, herbs, and potions made them suspicious in more superstitious times. One curious law in medieval London limited women to brewing for their own homes. Selling too much beer could invite legal trouble unless they joined a guild, most of which didn't admit women. This tension grew over time and played into the larger narrative of excluding women from the marketplace. But despite these challenges, many women continued brewing. Recipes were passed down in secret, scribbled on scraps of parchment, or whispered from mother to daughter. Some included unusual ingredients, from wildflowers to moss, even tiny bits of crushed eggshells believed to lighten the taste. Storage was another issue. Since there were no refrigerators, beer had to be consumed quickly. It was brewed in small batches every few days. Ceramic jugs, wooden casks, or leather bottles were used to store and transport it. In summer, souring was common, which led to creative solutions like mixing old ale with spices or fruit to make it drinkable again. In large castles and manors, beer production was industrial. Dedicated brewmasters oversaw workers, monitored barrels, and ensured a constant supply. These estates often had their own grain fields, malt houses, and brewing rooms. The beer was rationed by status. Servants got small beer, knights got better ale, and the lord drank only the strongest, clearest brew. Even the church used beer to fund its operations. Some monasteries became famous for their brewing, drawing pilgrims who came for both prayer and pints. Revenues from beer sales helped fund books, repairs, and charity. In a sense, ale built Europe's cathedrals. So, the next time you hear that medieval people drank beer because water wasn't safe, remember, that's only part of the story. Beer wasn't just safer. It was delicious, social, spiritual, medicinal, political, and essential. It was breakfast. It was celebration. It was comfort. And for many, it was life itself. In the next chapter, we'll go from drinking to dining and look at the strangest things that made it onto medieval plates. From moldy cheese to candied meat fat, we'll uncover what really happened at the table of kings and peasants alike. Moldy cheese and candied fat, what medieval people really ate. When we think of food in the Middle Ages, the first image that comes to mind might be a grand banquet. Long wooden tables piled high with roasted boar, chickens with golden skin, and goblets overflowing with mead. And yes, those feasts happened. But for most people, most of the time, medieval meals were a lot less glamorous, and sometimes surprisingly, odd. Let's begin with the staple diet of the average person: bread, porridge, and cheese. Bread was the foundation of every meal. But not all bread was created equal. The poor ate coarse, dark loaves made with rye, oats, or barley. These were often dense and rough, baked in communal ovens or on hot stones. The wealthy, on the other hand, enjoyed fine white bread made from sifted wheat flour, a luxury item. But sometimes even the best bread went bad. Without preservatives, bread could mold quickly, especially in damp weather. Still, waste was a sin, so moldy bread was often toasted, soaked in wine or ale, and served as part of a soup or pudding. Cheese was another common food, but again, it wasn't always fresh. Medieval cheese was typically aged, strong-smelling, and full of living cultures. Some cheeses were intentionally left to ferment, developing a thick rind and pungent aroma. A few even contained live larvae, yes, maggots, which were considered a sign of proper fermentation. In Sardinia, this tradition continues today with casu marzu, a cheese that wriggles with life. In the Middle Ages, such delicacies were served to honored guests. Porridge, or pottage, was a catch-all dish made from grains, vegetables, and sometimes scraps of meat. It simmered over the hearth all day, and whatever was available went into the pot. In poor homes, this might include roots, herbs, and day-old bread. In wealthier households, it could include almonds, raisins, saffron, and spices. Speaking of spices, here's something surprising. Medieval Europe loved spices. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, pepper, and ginger were in high demand, not because food tasted bland, but because spices were exotic, expensive, and impressive. They showed wealth. A dish spiced heavily wasn't just flavorful, it was a statement. But not all flavors were welcome. Let's talk about meat-fat desserts. In some recipes, animal fat, like lard or suet, was mixed with flour, sugar, and fruit to create sweet puddings. This was long before butter was widely used, so fat from cows or pigs was the go-to binder. One popular dish was mincemeat, which originally included meat, fat, dried fruit, and spices, all cooked together and sometimes stored for months. Some recipes called for beef drippings poured over gingerbread, or for candied chicken fat mixed with sugar and nuts. These combinations might seem strange today, but they were highly valued, especially when sugar itself was rare and expensive. Fermentation was everywhere, not just in ale and wine, but in sauerkraut, pickled eggs, and dried fish. Salted herring, smoked eel, and dried cod, stockfish were common in many regions, especially during religious fasts when meat was forbidden. These foods were often rehydrated or boiled, sometimes several times, to make them edible. One particularly intense food was arum, a fermented fish sauce borrowed from Roman cuisine. Made by packing fish, guts, blood, and salt into barrels and leaving them to rot in the sun, garum was used to flavor stews, meats, and vegetables. A medieval forerunner to Worcestershire sauce, if Worcestershire were made in a barn. Vegetables were common, but considered peasant food. Cabbage, onions, leeks, garlic, and beans formed the base of many meals. Nobles, preferring meat, often avoided vegetables unless they were part of a complex stew. Fruit was eaten fresh in season, but also dried or preserved. Apples, pears, plums, and cherries were boiled with honey or wine to make compotes. Wealthier households had access to citrus fruits like lemons or oranges, imported at great cost. Now let's talk about table manners, because they were very different from ours. Forks weren't commonly used until the Renaissance. Most people ate with spoons, knives, or their hands. Bread was often used as a plate, called a trencher, and soaked up juices from meat and sauces. After the meal, these bread plates were sometimes eaten or given to the poor. Clean hands were important, and hand washing before and after meals was customary, often with perfumed water. But once the food was served, people used their fingers freely. Sharing from common bowls was normal, and wiping your hands on the tablecloth wasn't always frowned upon. There were some unusual beliefs about food too. Medical theory held that different foods had different humoral properties: hot, cold, wet, dry, which affected the body's balance. For instance, beef was hot and dry, while fish was cold and moist. Meals were planned to maintain equilibrium. Overindulging in hot foods might make a person aggressive or feverish. Cold foods were thought to cause sluggishness or melancholy. Because of this, some strange combinations were created to balance humors. For example, hot spices were added to cold fish. Cold wine was paired with hot bread. Some meals even ended with sugar-coated fennel or peppercorns to help close the stomach. Feasts, of course, were another matter entirely. At royal tables, entire animals were cooked whole: peacocks, swans, and even porcupines. Their feathers or skins reattached after cooking to look lifelike. Some were filled with smaller birds or exotic ingredients. One famous dish, cockentrice, involved sewing together the front half of a pig with the back half of a capon, a castrated rooster, roasting them as one beast and serving them as a centerpiece. And what about sweets? Sugar was rare and precious, imported from the East. Most desserts were made with honey. Common sweets included honey cakes, marzipan, date balls, and fried dough. Almond milk was used often in cooking, especially on fasting days. It was a versatile substitute for dairy, used in sauces, soups, and desserts. One dessert that might shock modern readers was a dish called blancmange, a kind of white pudding made from shredded chicken, rice, and almond milk, thickened and sweetened. It was considered luxurious and was often dyed with saffron or rosewater. Food was more than survival. It was identity, status, and belief. What you ate revealed who you were, what you could afford, and how well you understood your place in the world. In the next chapter, we'll move from the table to the bedroom and uncover what sleeping arrangements were really like in a world without mattresses, privacy, or central heating. Medieval food was also deeply seasonal. There were no supermarkets or refrigerated transport. What people ate depended entirely on the time of year. In spring, fresh herbs like sorrel, wild garlic, and nettles appeared first, followed by greens and soft cheeses. Summer brought berries, cherries, and the first grains. Autumn was a season of abundance: apples, squash, nuts, and preserved meats. Winter was the hardest, and diets became repetitive: dried peas, onions, cured meats, and hard cheese. Preservation was key to survival. Medieval households used salting, smoking, drying, fermenting, and pickling to store food. Some homes had smokehouses where meat and fish were slowly dried over smoldering fires for days. Salt, though expensive, was used heavily for preserving pork and fish. Pickled vegetables were stored in clay pots, sometimes buried in the earth to stay cool. There were no fridges, only cellars, pantries, and ingenuity. In some regions, blocks of ice were cut from frozen lakes in winter and stored underground, insulated with straw to help keep food cold during the warmer months. Let's not forget the role of religion in shaping diets. The church dictated not only what people ate, but when. Fasting days, which included every Friday, plus Lent, Advent, and many saint days, required abstinence from meat, dairy, and sometimes eggs. This meant a large portion of the year was spent eating lean foods: fish, vegetables, legumes, and bread. As a result, fish became a central part of the medieval diet, even for inland populations. Monasteries and castles often kept their own fish ponds, stocked with carp, trout, or eels. Dried cod and herring were imported in vast quantities, forming one of the earliest international food trades. Some records from English castles show thousands of dried fish purchased every year to feed both lords and servants. Monastic cooks became incredibly skilled at creating variety within restrictions. They developed recipes for almond cheese, nut butter, and mock meats made from ground pulses and breadcrumbs. These dishes mimic texture and taste, helping maintain the illusion of feasting while remaining devout. Hunger, too, was a reality, especially for peasants. Crop failures, harsh winters, or political conflict could mean famine. In hard times, people turned to famine foods: bark, grass, acorns, or flour made from ground roots. These were difficult to digest and could be harmful in large quantities, but they were better than starving. Interestingly, many medieval people also foraged. Women and children gathered wild berries, mushrooms, herbs, and nuts. Some families knew the exact spots in the woods where wild garlic or hazelnuts grew each year. Foraging knowledge was passed down orally, and a good forager could feed a family when fields failed. Food was also part of medicine. Physicians prescribed specific diets based on age, temperament, and illness. A melancholic person was told to avoid lentils and favor roasted meats. The elderly were encouraged to eat soft, warm foods. Cold foods were heated with pepper, while dry foods were moistened with broth or wine. Even water, if it had to be consumed, might be mixed with vinegar, wine, or herbs to purify it. In noble households, no one drank plain water unless it came from a known spring, and even then it was usually boiled for safety. The presentation of food also mattered. Dishes were often dyed with natural colors, using beet juice, saffron, or spinach. Gold leaf might be added to a pie crust, or eggs painted with patterns for special holidays. At feasts, dishes were sometimes designed to surprise: a pie that released live birds when cut, or a roast shaped to resemble a dragon. The kitchen staff behind these creations worked tirelessly. Castles employed dozens of cooks, bakers, butchers, spit-turners, and dishwashers. Recipes were memorized and passed on through apprenticeships. Cookbooks existed but were rare, handwritten treasures used by royal chefs. Despite limited tools, these cooks mastered timing, fire control, and large-scale meal prep without the aid of timers or thermometers. Roasting a whole boar evenly required experience and intuition, and often took an entire day. So while medieval food might seem strange or even unappetizing today, it was born from creativity, necessity, and a deep connection to the land. Every meal told a story of the season, the region, the class, and the faith of those who ate it. In the next chapter, we'll slip quietly into the sleeping quarters of the medieval world, where beds were shared, privacy was rare, and warmth meant snuggling up with your entire family, and maybe even your animals. Sleeping in straw, beds, bodies, and the night in the Middle Ages. Let's begin with the basics. For most people, sleep didn't happen in a bed with a mattress and blanket. It happened on the floor, in a shared space, with straw-filled sacks, or blankets made of wool and rough linen. Peasants often slept on benches, against walls, or directly on earthen floors, sometimes with a bit of straw or old fabric for padding. Straw was the most common bedding material. A mattress might be nothing more than a large sack filled with straw or dried grass, laid directly on the floor. Over time, this straw became flattened, damp, and infested with bugs, so it had to be changed regularly, though many households couldn't afford to do this often. In winter, keeping warm was a bigger challenge than staying comfortable. Most houses had a single fire, and when the fire went out at night, the cold crept in fast. Families shared body heat by sleeping in tight groups. Children slept with their parents or siblings. In some cases, even animals, like dogs, pigs, or goats, were brought inside to share warmth. Chickens might roost in corners of the room. The term bedroom itself didn't appear until much later. In the medieval home, especially for peasants, there was typically just one room. This room was used for everything: cooking, eating, working, and sleeping. At night, furniture was pushed aside, and sleeping spaces were arranged on the floor. In the morning, the bedding was folded or hung up, and the room returned to daytime use. In wealthier homes, like those of merchants or minor nobility, there might be a separate chamber for sleeping. Here, beds were more elaborate: wooden frames with rope supports or planks, mattresses stuffed with feathers or wool, and canopies or curtains to keep out drafts and insects. Heavy fabric curtains also offered a sense of privacy, especially in shared halls. The richest nobles had grand four-poster beds, ornately carved and draped in embroidered cloth. These beds were often raised high off the floor, not just for style, but to avoid rats, dampness, and cold air. Stools or steps were sometimes needed to climb in. Even kings and queens didn't sleep alone. Servants might lie nearby on rush mats. Visitors could share the royal bed, not for intimacy. Unlike today's expectation of one continuous block of 8 hours, medieval people often experienced 2 sleeps. The first sleep began shortly after sunset and lasted until midnight or so. After that, people would wake naturally, sometimes staying awake for an hour or more before drifting into their second sleep until dawn. During this midnight interlude, people prayed, talked, meditated, or even visited neighbors. In monasteries, this time was used for matins, a set of night prayers. For others, it was a quiet, contemplative period considered healthy for the soul. Some couples used this time for intimacy, while others simply stoked the fire or checked on animals. The rhythm of sleep was more flexible. It followed natural light and body cues. Artificial light was limited to candles, rushlights, or oil lamps, so people went to bed early and rose with the sun. But sleep was not always peaceful. Darkness brought fear. With no police, locked doors, or well-lit streets, the night was a dangerous time. Spirits, thieves, and disease were all thought to roam after sundown. To protect themselves, people said prayers, placed iron tools under the bed, or sprinkled holy water in doorways. Some slept with blessed objects, like crosses, or hung herbs like lavender and rue above the sleeping area to ward off evil. Dreams were taken seriously. They were believed to carry messages from God, omens, or even warnings of sin. Books were written to help interpret dreams, and a strange or frightening vision could be discussed with a priest. Nightmares were thought to be caused by demons, indigestion, or a guilty conscience. Because of the cold, people rarely changed clothes for sleep. They might remove belts or outer garments, but underclothes were often worn day and night. Nightshirts existed for the wealthy, but many peasants slept in their work tunics. In winter, people slept in hats or wrapped their heads with cloth to keep warm. Lice and fleas were common companions. Without regular bathing or laundry, pests thrived in bedding and hair. Some people wore linen nightcaps soaked in vinegar or herbs to keep bugs away. Others slept on leather mats that could be wiped clean more easily. Marriage beds held special meaning. They were often blessed by a priest and decorated for the wedding night. In noble houses, a large wedding bed might be shown off to guests or even recorded in inventories. Heirloom beds were passed from generation to generation. For travelers, sleep was often even rougher. Inns were crowded and dirty. Guests might have to share beds with strangers, hence the phrase, sleeping with one eye open. Thieves, lice, and unpleasant smells were part of the experience. Some travelers brought their own bedding or chose to sleep in stables, which were warmer and offered more privacy. Monks and nuns had strict rules for sleep. In many orders, they slept in shared dormitories with minimal bedding, no pillows, and limited warmth. Silence was enforced, and sleep was interrupted by scheduled prayers. These sacrifices were meant to discipline the body and focus the mind on spiritual goals. Children, too, grew up with these customs. Babies slept swaddled tightly and were often placed beside mothers or in small hanging cradles near the hearth. As they grew older, they joined siblings on straw mats or shared family beds. Privacy, as we understand it today, was almost non-existent. Even in castles, walls were thin, doors were rare, and sound traveled easily. Curtains and hangings provided some visual separation, but noise and activity were constant. A noble might fall asleep to the sounds of servants whispering, dogs barking, and someone stirring the fire in the next room. Despite all this, people adapted. They found warmth in togetherness, rest in ritual, and safety in prayer. Sleep wasn't about plush pillows or silence. It was about making do, staying alive, and welcoming another day. In the next chapter, we'll trade dreams for scents and discover how people dealt with the smells of medieval life. From herbal perfumes to pockets full of vinegar-soaked sponges, you'll learn how they tried to make a very smelly world a little more bearable. Some wealthier households also adopted the practice of sleeping with religious texts under their pillows. It was believed that proximity to Holy Scripture would protect the sleeper from bad dreams, demons, or sudden death during the night. Psalm scrolls and illuminated manuscripts were sometimes wrapped in cloth and placed near the head or heart. Superstition shaped many nighttime behaviors. In rural villages, people believed that witches or evil spirits could enter homes during the night and cause illness or bad luck. To guard against this, horseshoes were hung above doors, and salt was sprinkled along windowsills or thresholds. Bells, both real and decorative, were believed to frighten away unwanted spirits when hung above beds or sewn into bed linens. Moonlight, too, was a concern. Some believed that sleeping under a full moon could cause madness or blindness. Heavy curtains or wooden shutters were used in upper-class homes to block moonbeams. In peasant homes, windows were often just small slits or covered with oiled cloth, reducing moonlight exposure naturally. Interestingly, there was also a communal aspect to sleep. In smaller communities, the sounds of breathing, whispering, and even the shifting of others became part of the nighttime rhythm. People found comfort in being close. Hearing a familiar voice or the snore of a spouse reassured them that all was well. Solitary sleeping was rare and sometimes seen as odd or unnatural. In colder months, heated stones or bricks were sometimes placed in beds before sleep. These were warmed in the fire, then wrapped in cloth and laid among the straw or beneath blankets to provide warmth for the first few hours of the night. Wealthier families might have bed warmers, metal pans filled with embers, to heat the sheets just before bedtime. Bed bugs were a common problem. The term "don't let the bed bugs bite" has medieval roots, and it was taken seriously. Beds were occasionally disassembled and aired out. Herbs such as pennyroyal, mint, and tansy were scattered among the straw or sewn into sachets to deter insects. Lighting was kept minimal. A single rushlight or candle might burn during the early evening, but most households slept in near total darkness. Candles were expensive, and fire was dangerous, so lights were extinguished early. Only the wealthiest homes had multiple candles burning after sunset, and even then, they were carefully watched. The smell of sleep was very different from today. Without soap or daily bathing, the human scent was strong. Combined with the smell of smoke from the hearth, drying herbs, damp straw, and occasionally animals, the medieval bedroom was earthy and pungent. Still, this was normal. Noses were accustomed to it, and the smell of a warm home was comforting, even if it would seem unpleasant to us. In rare cases, people documented dreams they had during the night, not in personal diaries, but in spiritual journals. These dreams were examined for signs, warnings, or answers to prayer. A vision of a dead relative might be taken as a blessing or a call to confession. Some kept dream books under the bed, filled with interpretations written by monks or clerics. For many, the night was sacred. It was a time to connect with the divine, to rest the body, and to reflect on mortality. Every night offered a small reminder of the great sleep to come, death, and every morning a chance to begin again. So next time you slip into clean sheets and fluff a feather pillow, imagine the medieval family huddled close in a dark, cold room, heads on straw, listening for wolves in the woods and whispering prayers into the night. In the next chapter, we'll explore the strange world of medieval scents, from herbal amulets to pomanders and vinegar cloths. In a time when bathing was rare, masking body odor was both a science and an art. Perfume, herbs, and vinegar, the fight against medieval stench. Let's begin by imagining a typical medieval town or village. Narrow streets lined with timber houses, livestock roaming freely, and people going about their daily business. Sounds quaint, until you remember that these same streets were often filled with raw sewage, animal waste, and rotting food. In cities, household waste, including chamber pots, was frequently dumped right out the window. The phrase "garde l'eau," watch out for the water, was shouted as a warning before tossing dirty water or worse into the alley below. Gutters overflowed, and stagnant water created a constant stench that permeated the air. Public latrines were scarce, especially for the poor, and sanitation systems were primitive at best. Even in wealthier homes, toilets were usually privy pits, holes dug into the ground, often located just outside the main building or attached to towers and castles, dropping waste into moats. So how did people survive these conditions, or at least try to smell better? The answer lies in a mix of herbs, perfumes, oils, and innovative medieval creativity. One of the most common strategies was the use of herbal amulets and sachets. People carried small pouches filled with dried flowers and fragrant herbs. Lavender, rosemary, mint, sage, and thyme were especially popular. These were tucked into sleeves, worn around the neck, or pinned inside clothing to ward off both bad smells and, it was believed, bad spirits. Wealthier individuals used pomanders, decorative metal or wooden balls that opened up to hold aromatic substances. Pomanders were often worn on chains, held in hand, or tucked into belts. Inside, they might contain musk, ambergris, cinnamon, cloves, and other expensive imports. Not only did they mask odors, but they were also considered protective charms against disease, especially during plagues. Speaking of disease, people in the Middle Ages believed that bad air, or miasma, was responsible for spreading illness. To combat this, many wore masks or scarves, so personal hygiene was another battlefield in the war against odor. Daily bathing was rare, but spot washing was common. People wiped their faces, hands, and underarms with damp cloths, often infused with rosewater or herbal infusions. Vinegar and wine were used as disinfectants. In wealthier households, servants might prepare basins of scented water for their lords and ladies to refresh themselves. For body odor, people relied on perfumed balms and oils. These were rubbed onto the skin, especially on the wrists, neck, and behind the ears. Common ingredients included olive oil, beeswax, rose petals, myrrh, and frankincense. Some formulas were closely guarded family secrets, passed down through generations. Hair was treated with fragrant powders and oils both to cleanse and to scent. Combs made of bone or wood were used to distribute oils evenly and remove lice. A mixture of rosemary water and alcohol was sometimes used as a rinse to refresh the scalp. Clothing played a large role in managing odor. Because most garments were made of wool or linen and not washed frequently, they absorbed and held smells. To counter this, people aired their clothes regularly, hanging them near smoke, incense, or over herbs. In wealthier homes, wardrobes might be lined with cedar or lavender to keep clothes fresh and repel moths. Laundering, when it happened, was a laborious process. Clothes were soaked in lye or urine, scrubbed with ash or soapwort, and beaten on stones. Afterward, they were dried in the sun and sometimes sprinkled with flour water. Soap was made from animal fat and wood ash, effective but harsh on fabrics and skin. Inside the home, scent was used strategically. Floors were covered in rushes, straw, or herbs, which were replaced periodically. These floor coverings trapped dirt and smells, but also added a pleasant fragrance when walked upon. Bay leaves, mint, and marjoram were common choices. At feasts and gatherings, especially in noble homes, bowls of rose petals and citrus peels were placed on tables to mask the smell of unwashed bodies. Incense was burned, not just for religious reasons, but to cleanse the air. Frankincense and myrrh were especially valued for their strong, lingering aromas. Women's beauty routines were deeply tied to scent. Facial masks made from honey and crushed herbs were common, and perfumes were often dabbed on linen handkerchiefs or sewn into hair accessories. In some cultures, women perfumed their veils or sleeves so that their movements would release a subtle fragrance. Men also participated in scent culture. Knights sometimes rubbed themselves with aromatic oil before battle, not just for masking sweat, but as a symbol of strength and honor. A sweet-smelling warrior was seen as noble and controlled, despite the blood and armor. During times of plague, scent became survival. Doctors wore plague masks with long beak-like noses filled with aromatic substances, thought to protect them from the deadly miasma. Herbal baths, vinegar compresses, and even smoke from burning rosemary were used to cleanse the body and ward off infection. But it wasn't all about humans. Churches and public spaces were also perfumed. Incense burners swung during services masked the smell of crowded worshippers and carried prayers to heaven. Even tombs were sometimes filled with herbs to hide the stench of decay. Despite the efforts, the medieval world still stank to us, but to them it was normal. Their noses adapted, their rituals evolved, and their relationship to scent was far more active and layered than ours. In the next chapter, we'll enter the world of medieval beauty again, this time looking at their obsession with pale skin, drawn-on veins, and lip stains made from crushed beetles. What was seen as delicate and divine might now send a chill down your spine. The science of scent in the Middle Ages was also heavily influenced by the concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Each person's temperament was thought to be governed by a combination of these humors, and scents were believed to influence their balance. For example, someone who was melancholic, governed by black bile, might be prescribed bright, cheerful scents like orange blossom, mint, or rose to lift their spirits. A choleric person, ruled by yellow bile, might benefit from cooling fragrances like violet or water lily. Physicians often carried sachets of scent, not only to protect themselves from illness, but to soothe and balance their patients. Perfume production itself became a sophisticated craft. Apothecaries and perfumers experimented with distillation, a technique learned from Arabic science to extract essential oils from flowers and herbs. Rosewater, one of the most commonly used perfumed liquids, was produced in large quantities and used for everything from washing hands to flavoring food. Perfume was also closely tied to social class. While the poor relied on herbs and smoke, the elite could afford imported resins, spices, and oils. A noble woman's identity was partly communicated through scent. She might choose a specific blend of rose, sandalwood, and clove that became known as her signature. Some perfumes were so strong, they lingered in rooms long after their wearer had left. Scent was even used as a form of currency in diplomacy and courtship. Gifting someone a vial of precious perfume was a sign of deep respect or romantic interest. Royal families exchanged exotic oils as part of marriage negotiations or international alliances. A princess might bring a dowry not only of gold and land, but also rare fragrances from distant lands. Religious ceremonies continued to reinforce the power of scent. Burning incense in churches was believed to purify the soul and elevate prayers. The mingling smells of wax, frankincense, and hundreds of unwashed bodies became a unique spiritual experience. Overwhelming to modern senses, but meaningful to medieval worshippers. In rural areas, scent was more practical. Shepherds carried garlands of herbs around their necks to ward off flies and sickness. Farmers stuffed their boots with strong-smelling plants to mask foot odor and prevent infection. Herbs were burned in fields to drive away pests and evil spirits alike. One particularly interesting practice was the use of sweet bags sewn into undergarments. These small sachets, filled with dried petals, spices, and bits of soap, were worn beneath layers of clothing to keep the body smelling fresh. Some people even stitched them into the seams of their garments so the scent would be released slowly as they moved. During times of illness or fear, scent rituals took on an almost magical dimension. Some households hung wreaths of garlic or angelica at doors and windows. In times of plague, entire towns might burn barrels of tar or aromatic wood in the streets, hoping the smoke would purify the air. Scent became both shield and signal, a way to communicate health, status, and faith. And let's not forget the perfumes of punishment. In rare cases, criminals were forced to carry or wear offensive-smelling objects as public humiliation. Rotten fish or spoiled meat might be hung around a thief's neck. In contrast, saints and martyrs were sometimes said to emit sweet odors upon death, a sign of divine favor. As time progressed and trade expanded, the variety and complexity of perfumes grew. The arrival of new ingredients like jasmine, citrus peel, and vanilla transformed perfumery into an art. By the end of the Middle Ages, scent had moved from survival tool to status symbol, though its original purpose lingered in tradition. So, in the medieval world, smell was not just a background experience. It was part of the culture, the medicine, the fashion, and the faith. It defined you before you spoke and lingered long after you left. In the next chapter, we'll return to the mirror and look again at how medieval people transformed their faces into expressions of status, spirituality, and sacrifice. From painted lips to powdered skin, get ready for another layer of the medieval beauty ritual. Drawn veins and beetle lips, the art of medieval makeup. Let's begin with the most prized trait: pale, flawless skin. In medieval Europe, a pale complexion wasn't just fashionable, it was political. Pale skin meant that you did not labor outdoors. You were noble, protected, soft, and feminine. The paler the skin, the more delicate and worthy you were considered. It was a sign that your body belonged indoors, shielded, pure, and untouched by the world. To achieve this look, both men and women used white lead powders. We've mentioned this before, but now let's talk about the daily ritual. After washing their face, sometimes with rose water or milk, the person would take a cloth, puff, or fingers and apply a thick layer of powder across the forehead, cheeks, nose, and neck. The powder dried into a chalky finish and had to be reapplied often as it cracked or flaked away. Some individuals went further, adding a light blush made from crushed beetles, cochineal, or cinnabar, a mercury compound. These substances were ground and mixed with oil, wine, or even egg whites to make a usable paste. The contrast of red on white made the cheeks appear more youthful and vibrant, even if the skin underneath was slowly deteriorating from toxicity. Lips, too, were colored with natural dyes. Crushed berries, red wine residue, and beet juice were common among the poor. Nobles used imported powders and mineral pigments, sometimes containing ingredients we now know to be harmful. The idea was not to create a bold, seductive mouth, as in modern makeup, but to suggest vitality and health. A touch of red meant life. A pale, colorless lip meant sickness or death. And then there were the veins. In the late medieval and early Renaissance period, especially in Italy and France, women began drawing artificial veins onto their skin with blue ink. Yes, veins. Delicate, thin, blue lines were painted across the temples, down the forehead, or along the neck to mimic visible veins beneath translucent skin. The goal? To look so pale, so pure, that your skin was almost see-through, like marble. Artists painted noble women this way in portraits, and real women imitated the art. The veins had to be subtle and elegant, not too dark, not too crooked. They were usually painted with natural blue pigments, sometimes mixed with vinegar or oil to help them stay in place. It was tedious and strange, and a sign of supreme beauty. Eyebrows were shaped or removed entirely, as in previous centuries. Foreheads were plucked high to elongate the face. If any brows were drawn back on, they were usually thin, arched, and placed far above the natural brow line. Eyes were treated with care, too. While heavy eye makeup wasn't common in Northern Europe, coal or soot was used in the Middle East and Mediterranean regions, and some of that influence drifted into Southern Europe. Eye whitening drops made from plant extracts, or believe it or not, egg whites, were used to create a clear, bright-eyed look. Teeth were a tricky subject. There was a desire for white teeth, but no safe way to achieve them. People rubbed their teeth with crushed eggshells, burnt rosemary, or even bricks to polish the enamel. Some recipes suggested rubbing the gums with salt and honey, or rinsing with vinegar and wine. Lip color helped give the illusion of brighter teeth, a visual trick we still use today. Hair was another major element of beauty. Blonde hair was especially desired. Women used saffron, alum, and even urine and sunlight to lighten their hair. They would comb the mixture through their locks and sit outside for hours, faces shaded, while their hair turned a golden hue. Some went further, applying lye or ashes to bleach the strands, with predictably damaging results. Hair was often hidden beneath veils, hoods, or wimples, but that didn't make it unimportant. In fact, concealed hair was considered even more erotic because it was private, visible only to a husband or lover. So while public appearance emphasized modesty, the secret effort behind beauty was deeply personal and intimate. Fragrance was used alongside makeup. Rosewater and violet water were dabbed onto the face after application to set powders or reduce irritation. Small scented cloths were tucked into bodices or sleeves, so the body gave off a pleasant scent during conversation or dance. One curious trend was the use of gold leaf in makeup, Tiny flecks of gold were applied to the temples or cheeks for celebrations or court appearances. It reflected candlelight and created a shimmering aura, a literal glow of wealth. Gold was also thought to have spiritual or health benefits, connecting the wearer to divine beauty. Men, too, engaged in cosmetics. Courtly men applied powder to reduce shine, tinted their lips and cheeks, and perfumed their garments. A clean, smooth face was associated with elegance, discipline, and spiritual refinement. Some wore wigs or bleached their hair to appear younger or more fashionable, but all of this came at a cost. Prolonged use of lead and mercury-based products caused disfigurement, tremors, skin sores, and even death. Some noblewomen became addicted to their powders, applying more and more to cover the damage, trapped in a cycle of beautification and decay. There are historical records of women collapsing, their faces swollen and discolored beneath the white mask, and yet they continued. Because beauty, in the medieval mind, was more than vanity. It was virtue. A beautiful woman was closer to God, or so the thinking went. Physical beauty reflected inner grace. To appear angelic was to be favored. So even if it meant suffering, even if it meant sickness, beauty was pursued like a calling. In the next chapter, we'll leave behind the mirror and enter the realm of love, courtly romance, chaste longing, secret tokens, and the strange rituals of medieval flirting. Prepare to fall in love the 14th century way. Despite the health risks, cosmetics continued to evolve in sophistication and symbolism. A woman's beauty was seen not only as a reflection of personal discipline, but as a representation of her family's honor. To appear in public with a patchy or dull complexion could be interpreted as a failure of both character and upbringing. Because mirrors were expensive and uncommon, women often relied on servants or sisters to help with their appearance. These assistants learned how to blend powders, smooth ointments, and arrange veils or coifs just so. In noble households, the ladies' chamber became a private world of feminine artistry, a space of confidence, creativity, and sometimes insecurity. Recipes for cosmetics were often shared in letters between noblewomen. These letters included not only instructions for mixing beauty bombs, but also personal tips, gossip, and even prayers. One surviving manuscript from the 15th century contains an entire section titled, "To Keep the Face Young and Lovely," offering concoctions of egg white, alum, vinegar, and powdered pearls. In some regions, beauty was also tied to the astrological calendar. Certain times of year were considered better for plucking hair, applying creams, or bathing. The waxing moon, for example, was associated with hair growth, while the waning moon was ideal for removing unwanted body hair. Herbal beauty treatments were picked and prepared according to planetary influence, linking vanity to the cosmos. Another strange beauty trick. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, was used in small amounts to dilate the pupils and create a dreamy, wide-eyed appearance. Women dropped tiny amounts into their eyes before court appearances. While the effect was mesmerizing, it was also dangerous. Prolonged use could cause blindness. In Italy, especially during the Renaissance, the pursuit of beauty reached almost theatrical levels. Wealthy women wore decorative patches, often made of silk or velvet, to cover blemishes and accentuate features. These patches might be heart-shaped or star-shaped and were strategically placed near the lips, over the cheekbone, or beside the eye, adding an air of mystery. Some believed these patches carried coded messages. A star near the eye might suggest flirtation. A heart on the cheek suggested passion. Whether true or imagined, the power of suggestion was part of the beauty ritual. Meanwhile, hair removal was not limited to the face. Women removed hair from arms, legs, and even fingers using pastes made from lime, arsenic, or vinegar-soaked cloths. These methods were painful and sometimes cause burns or lasting damage. But smooth, pale skin was the goal. In parts of France, a trend emerged for tinted fingernails. Noble women rubbed herbs or pigments into the nails and buffed them to a soft glow. The nails were kept short and rounded, with pink or pearl tones preferred. Long, dirty nails were a sign of labor, not leisure. Cosmetics also found their way into literature. Poets described their muses as having lips red as crushed cherries and skin like snow. Beauty was idealized, not just in courts, but in ballads, paintings, and religious art. Saints were portrayed as glowing and pure, as if divine beauty were part of their holiness. Ironically, many religious leaders condemned the use of makeup. Sermons warned women not to deceive with paint, claiming it was vanity or even witchcraft. But others argued that if beauty pleased one's husband and maintained social order, it had its place. By the end of the Middle Ages, beauty had become a carefully cultivated language, one written in powder, pigment, oil, and ritual. A language every noble woman learned to speak, even if it came at great cost. So next time you open a makeup bag or look in a mirror, think of the woman in the candlelit chamber, drawing tiny blue veins across her ivory forehead, praying not only for love and admiration, but for health, safety, and survival. In the final chapter, we'll step back and look at it all, the pain, the perfumes, the powdered faces, and ask, what does all of this tell us about the medieval soul? Join me for the conclusion of our strange, scented, and shadowed journey through history. A world that smelled, shivered, and shined. Final thoughts on medieval habits. So what can we make of everything we've seen? Of people rubbing urine on their faces, drawing on veins with ink, eating moldy cheese, and sleeping with farm animals. At first glance, medieval habits might seem laughable, even revolting. But when we look closer, we begin to see something else. A world of creativity, resilience, and meaning. A world where every ritual, no matter how odd to us, was rooted in logic, belief, and survival. Let's return for a moment to the idea of beauty. In our modern world, beauty is commercial. It's found on magazine covers, social media filters, and makeup tutorials. But in the Middle Ages, beauty was moral. A pale face wasn't just attractive, it was holy. It suggested spiritual cleanliness, self-control, and submission to a divine order. Painted veins and powdered cheeks weren't vanity. They were visual theology. And yet, there was vanity. There was flirtation, experimentation, even obsession. The woman drawing stars on her cheek or tinting her nails with crushed herbs wasn't so different from someone applying mascara or highlighter today. She was chasing the best version of herself, or the version society told her to chase. We've seen how poverty shaped every habit. For peasants, cleanliness meant a bucket of rainwater, a vinegar cloth, or a handful of herbs. A bath might be a yearly event, but they did what they could. They hung rosemary above the hearth, rubbed mint on their skin, and turned laundry day into a village affair. They couldn't afford perfume, so they made the world itself fragrant. The noblewoman, swathed in silk and gold powder, wasn't cleaner, just better scented. Her world was more refined, but just as flawed. Beneath her rosewater and violet oil, she suffered from lead poisoning, mercury sores, and fragile self-worth. And there was food. From children sipping beer at breakfast to the carefully constructed roast animals of court feasts, meals reflected status, belief, and ingenuity. The stomach was not just for eating. It was a battleground of the four humors, a place where balance had to be maintained with care and flavor. Even sleep was symbolic. Families curled together like hibernating animals, whispering prayers into the dark. Dreams were read like scripture. The night wasn't silent, it was spiritual. And amid the fleas and lice, there was still love, warmth, and laughter. Scent, too, became more than a tool. It was medicine, identity, and armor. To smell good was to be safe, clean, devout, and desirable. From pomanders to plague masks, every inhalation was a kind of decision. Protect me, hide me, present me. And what about the human body itself? It was dressed, scrubbed, painted, and reshaped, just like today. But it was also believed in. The body carried the soul. Its appearance reflected its alignment with God or with sin. The body wasn't just flesh, it was a moral statement. And that made every habit, no matter how strange, deeply meaningful. So, what do these habits tell us? They tell us that humans will always try to make sense of their world. When water is scarce, they find vinegar. When danger lurks, they light herbs. When beauty is defined by pain, they pluck and powder. They adapt. They also tell us that we are not so different. We wear cologne to job interviews. We shave, dye, tan, or bleach to match ideals. We skip meals, post selfies, and take vitamins. And when the lights go out, we whisper fears and dreams just like they did, hoping the morning will bring something better. Yes, medieval habits were often gross, but they were also tender, resourceful, and rich with intention. The woman applying beetle-based lip stain by candlelight wasn't a fool. She was a survivor, a mother, a lover, a saint. The man who washed his face with urine and drank small beer for breakfast wasn't ignorant. He was practical, cautious, and doing the best he could. Their world stank. It cracked, it bled, it wept. But it also glittered. It prayed. It hoped. And so, as we close this journey through the unscented perfumes, the drawn-on foreheads, and the steaming pots of pottage, remember this. Behind every bizarre medieval habit was a real human. A person with desires and doubts. A person who wanted to look better, feel cleaner, live longer, or love harder. Just like us. Let's reflect a bit more on the relationship between belief and behavior. Because in the medieval world, belief was behavior. You didn't just wash to be clean. You washed because cleanliness was linked to salvation. You didn't just eat for nourishment. You ate to balance the body and the soul. Even the smells that we explored were symbolic. Sweetness was associated with goodness, decay with corruption. The stench of a sinner was not just metaphor. It was taken literally in some texts. Saints were said to smell like flowers even after death. Those who lived righteously were believed to emit odors of sanctity. And when you think about it, isn't that the case today too? We talk about good energy, clean living, toxicity, language soaked in morality. The medieval mindset isn't gone. It just wears a different fragrance. As we dug through these strange habits, the vinegar cloths, the bug-infested bedding, the painted cheeks, we also uncovered a deep longing for dignity. These weren't mindless customs. They were acts of resistance against a world that was chaotic, cruel, and short-lived. Death came quickly in the Middle Ages. Disease swept through cities. War was never far. Even childbirth was a gamble. So what did people do? They braided their hair with rosemary. They perfumed their sleeves. They arranged herbs underfoot and inked tiny veins across their temples. It was theater, yes, but it was also courage. Consider the feast tables we visited. Beneath the meat pies and sugared pork, there was often famine. A single failed harvest could mean starvation. But when food was available, it was displayed with pride, offered in generosity, and seasoned with ritual. They feasted like it was sacred, because it was. Then there was the night, that cold, crowded, lice-ridden time. And yet, people told stories in the dark. They cuddled under shared blankets. They prayed aloud, mumbled dreams, and listened to the fire crackle. There was intimacy in that darkness. Even in discomfort, they found communion. We might laugh at the strangeness of their habits, but how strange are our own? We inject poison into our faces to freeze time. We glue synthetic hairs onto eyelids. We wear perfumes with chemical names we can't pronounce. We build temples of light, steel, and glass, and still sleep with a nightlight, still long for touch, still apply creams that promise immortality. The truth is, the Middle Ages are not as far away as we think. Their world was harsher, yes, but it was also more connected to the rhythms of nature, the cycle of seasons, the reality of death. They saw the body as part of the cosmos, shaped by the stars, ruled by humors, refined by practice. There was no Photoshop, no TikTok filters, no Amazon deliveries. And still, they had standards. They had beauty ideals. They had shame and pride. They looked in reflective water and hoped to see something worthy staring back. So, what can we learn from them? Maybe we can learn to appreciate our comforts more. The hot showers, the clean sheets, the refrigerated food. Maybe we can learn to see past disgust and find meaning in the habits that once made people feel holy, worthy, loved. Maybe we can stop judging the past so harshly and instead see it as a mirror. Not a perfect one, but a reflection that reminds us that people have always been people. They tried, they failed, they adjusted, they dreamed. A young girl pressing rose petals into wax to make her first perfume. A boy helping his father soak wool in a bucket of stale urine. A woman whispering a prayer as she draws a line of blue across her cheek. These are not caricatures. They are us, centuries removed. We have more in common with them than we do with the polished fantasy versions of ourselves we see online. The medieval world was messy, but it was honest. It didn't hide its labor. It wore its rituals openly. So let's honor that. Let's honor the hands that boiled herbs in kitchens, the fingers that rubbed oil into cracked heels, the mouths that prayed for beauty and not just for survival. Let's honor their humanity, their smell, their dust, their longing. And let's close this chapter not with judgment, but with gratitude, because while their world may be gone, their spirit still lingers. In every act of self-care, every shared meal, every candlelit reflection. Good night, again, and thank you for walking beside me through the beautiful, bizarre, unforgettable world of medieval life.